This is the Powered Up Podcast, show 46.
But I say these are our norms. These are our non-negotiables. And one of those non-negotiables is that students have to produce every day. What are they producing? And in an opportunity, because one of the other norms is to engage with their peers. So I want to be able to interact. I want to be able to communicate in a meaningful way and produce something new with the information that I've learned that day. Like those are two of the non-negotiables. And it's like if that's happening, then I know that students are going to be engaged.
Welcome to a real-world education with insight and advice from teachers in the game, where current and former educators reveal what truly sets apart the great teachers and what it takes to make a positive impact on students. Whether you're in pre-service learning, new to the game, or a seasoned veteran, this is the show for you. You'll leave feeling inspired to take action because we are powering education by empowering you.
Greetings, everyone. This is Ken Ehrman, host of the Powered Up Podcast, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Matt the Frolfer Rogers. Matt, I'm going to throw you for a loop here. I did not tell you this. We had an amazing show. We had an amazing conversation that we did not want to end, and we continued to extend even when we were skipping sections of our show. So it made me think of when you know you have great centers planned for your classroom and they're going to take a little bit longer than they normally do. And so you have to blast through the anticipatory set of your lesson to jump right into the centers. So we're going to do that right now. I'm giving you 30 seconds. I will cut you off. Give me anything that you want to point out about what's fantastic about tonight's interview. Go.
So I think tonight's interview really covers the idea of teaching in an environment that you want to teach in. And we hear from an administrator that creates an environment that is every place that I'd want to work for. It's all about creativity, the idea of engagement, the idea of taking risks and kind of not necessarily apologizing. Oh no, 10 seconds. But also, I think the last part, which we extended the conversation on, which is treating others the way that, or creating an environment where kids learn how to be real citizens, is probably the way that I would put it.
Definitely. So I really wanted to give you a minute. So I told you 30 seconds. And you did it in 40 seconds. That was pretty good.
All right.
Yeah, our interview with tonight with Charles is just, it's fantastic. He's a great principal. You know, he's gone through the ranks of education, and we dive into so many different topics, like you said, about risk taking and then turning it to the equity piece as well. So this is one to listen to for inspiration, for key ideas, and to share with your leaders. So if you're a teacher listening to this, you know, first of all, please share this out. Second of all, please leave us some comments, ratings, reviews. We know you're listening. We see the stats. We want to hear from you. What do you like about our show? What do you want us to change? What do you want us to do different? But share this with a leader too, because Charles is an inspirational one for principals and district administrators to tune into. So without any further delay, let's jump into that interview with Charles. Hi, Charles. Welcome to the Powered Up Podcast. How you doing today?
Hey, Ken. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share this space with you.
Absolutely. We're really excited to jump into this conversation with you. So to kick things off, please officially introduce yourself, share with us where you're coming from, and just kind of a brief snapshot of what your career in education has looked like.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? As time goes on, that brief snapshot's a little harder, but so I am coming from Northwest Indiana, though I am a current principal in Chicago. So I have been in education for a little over 15 years now. I have served as a teacher, mentor and lead teacher, an assistant principal, and a principal. I've been a principal for the last, I want to say it's now 8 years. Just doing a lot of work in this area. So, I always wanted to see how I could expand my reach. And so, that's why I went from teacher to administration. And so from administration, I have a podcast. I'm the host of the Counter Narrative podcast. I co-host a web show for educational leaders called Inside the Principal's Office. I just wrote a book. Well, co-wrote a book, I should say. I can't take all the credit. That book is coming later. And I've launched a consulting company, so I do workshops and speak at conferences, and so a lot of different things. Just always trying to say like, how can I make my impact in the world of ed bigger before my time here is done?
That's great. That's really, it's really inspiring to see teachers who take action, who take responsibilities outside of the classroom, whether it be coaching all the sports teams or volunteering for every, club or committee that happens in the school. What do you find, as you clearly have these traits with everything that you've taken on and worked for in your career? What do you find is common between those teachers that I'm sure you have in your building or that you've worked with in the past? What is it that those teachers possess that other teachers can strive for or can do to do more than just what our normal responsibilities are, which as teachers is always daunting? But how can we take it one step further?
Yeah. So, well, one thing is be single and don't have children. That always helps. Not that I was either, but I just think I think a lot of times it stems from your passion, right? It's this desire, and I don't want to exclude the teachers who are like, well, I'm passionate, but I go home at 4, right? Like, no, but there's just this desire to do more, right? That there's no way. I was when I taught, I was in the middle school, high school, so I didn't have a group of kids all day long. I had you for 40 minutes, 50 minutes, and I was like, I can never do enough in that amount of time. So I was always looking for opportunities of how can I do more with you. So yeah, I was the what do they call it? A sponsor for the Spanish club, even though I'm not even Hispanic. But I was like, sure, I'll do it. Right? Was I taught them how to do this tango for this dance club. Like I was just, even if I didn't know what I was doing, it was an opportunity for me to connect with my students, right? And we talk a lot, especially now, about building relationships and rapport, and that's what I looked at. Like it was an opportunity to get to know my students on a whole nother level. And so I even do the same thing now with my staff. We do this thing called Teach Plus One. So I ask my staff at least run one thing during the year, whether it's one quarter, whether it's a semester, whatever it is, run one thing, and just take that time to share your passions and connect it with the students' passions, and it changes the entire dynamic of the school. And I think for those teachers who are hesitant, maybe it's a sense of pressure or duty or an obligation, but maybe to shift that mindset and say this is a chance for me to build those relationships, and it makes your job so much easier when a kid walks into your classroom and they know, hey, like you love anime, and we have that connection now. Like more than likely that kid's not going to be a problem in your class, right? And so you look at it as an investment, right, in the work that you're doing. It makes your life easier, one, if that's what you're looking for, but it makes it that much more, I think, impactful and richer, if nothing else.
Would
Yeah.
you say, sorry, Matt, I want to, because I'm actually going to throw this to you. We talked about this, I think, not on the recording last week, Matt, but about how you've been in a position now for I think 8 years teaching fourth grade, and you finally feel like you're in a spot where you can be a great teacher, but not take home 3 hours of work because you've been in it. You innovating is a little bit easier. You're still updating your craft and you're still bringing the best product to your students, but you understand the content at a much more meaningful level. So kind of throw this to both of you. Either of you can jump in. How can we help teachers become more efficient in their positions so that they feel like they can take on that plus one? Because I think teachers don't always recognize the need for being efficient and more productive. Not to say they're not working hard, but just working smarter, not harder. So, Matt, what are ways you found that? And then Charles, I'll let you jump in too.
Well, I think, Charles, what you said, and then I'll get into the question. What you brought up is we almost have this impending feeling that we're responsible the later we get into our career to start acquiring more. Like I taught 5 years of special ed and then moved to regular ed. happened that myself and a brand new teacher were joining fourth grade. So that kind of led me when I switched positions to say, you know what, I have more experience. I need to take on this opportunity. And being partnered with a new teacher, it was almost like I needed to display to them what the life of teaching is. And the life of teaching is so much more than just the scope and sequence of instruction. And that's at least how I feel that when I kind of got that responsibility, I viewed myself as almost the head teacher of that grade level, right? If someone's going to ask what the reference point or what fourth grade was thinking, I had to be prepared. But it felt very much like I needed to expand my stamina without stretching it too thin. Like I didn't want to go hollow and not give answers that I couldn't back up. And there are definitely times that as you accept these roles, um, whether it's efficient or not, Ken, right? Directly to your question, I can give an efficient, direct answer, yes or no, and we can be done with it. But I think that that key is how do you acquire more and more stamina to handle the next thing, but also recognize when too much is too much, which doesn't answer either part of the question, but I think that was my thinking, Charles. Honestly, from your end, going from that regular ed teacher in the high school where you taught for 40 minutes, you probably had ridiculously well planned 40-minute lessons that you repeated a few times, and that led into being able to. You have your curriculum down. That's probably a passion point for you already. Then go into the lead teaching, go into the mentoring, go into the assistant principal. That assistant principal is a shock to the system, much like from assistant principal to head principal, a shock to your system. But they talk about the first 90 days being the hardest days where you just acquire the stamina, but also the know-how of how to handle that position. So I don't know how you want to go from that, but that's my perspective. I think I've been doing this long enough in fourth grade, at least, that the curriculum side, the behavior, what I can expect maturation wise is not new. I have my curriculum. I have enough that if I don't want to build something brand new, at the end of the day, I can kind of tap into a really good lesson that I've taught before and be able to survive. Um, so when it comes to efficient, it's that, you know what, I feel like I have a really good pulse in my class. I'm going to try something, and I've done this long enough that I can do it off the top of my head, which is probably not what you can do, Charles, in your position now.
Yeah, yeah. Matt, I'd have to agree with you. Like, I think key is figuring out, am I ready for that? Right? Don't overstretch. Don't, sometimes we're overzealous. I'm that guy. I'm just like, yeah, yeah, let's do it. And then I look and I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Right? And so it's not for everyone. But I think, speaking from the viewpoint of a leader, if that is something that I want my teachers to do, then it is also my job to make sure that I'm not overloading you as a teacher, right? Like if I want you to run an after school program, I have to be cognizant to say, am I giving you too much during the day to where you're exhausted and now you don't want to do an after school program? And I sit there like, well, why aren't you doing an after school program? So it's, coming from, this position, operating the entire school, it's how do I streamline processes and procedures so that way you as a teacher can be more effective, how, you can be more efficient, to where now you feel comfortable saying, hey, you know what, I don't mind, staying after on a Tuesday, or twice a week, whatever it may be, and doing this extra thing because I know like these systems are in place that it's going to be okay at the end. But I absolutely agree, Matt. Like, don't don't jump into something just because and before you're ready. Like, I will respect a teacher much more who says, "Look, I'm not ready for that yet. I'm still figuring this out. Can I do this? How can you help me so that way I can get there?" Instead of just being a yes man and saying, "Yeah, sure, let me do it," and then watching it just completely collapse because you weren't ready. So, there's definitely that communication. It's understanding where you are and having the confidence to say yes or no to an opportunity.
Well, and just to kind of add off that, I feel like from your end, this plus one perspective I think is awesome. The perspective I'd almost use my favorite thing that I bring up with Ken, the technology with new content, like situation, that dilemma. How do you incorporate both of those? If you're starting something from scratch, make sure it's a passion project that you already care a ton about. If you're just assisting, like you're assisting the Spanish program, make sure it's already up and running, that you're just monitoring and supporting, right? Like we can either fill both roles. I can think back to my high school years. There were clubs that I started from scratch, and I had the support of someone that knew the subject matter, was willing to dive in because it was what they were working on outside of their school hours. On the flip side, when I did yearbook or whatever, a radio station, right? These type things, that was a well-oiled machine. The guy just had to sign off on checks for materials and make sure that the schedule was set, right? Like both of those are very valuable. And so maybe it's intimidating to go into something well functioning and continuing that process or being responsible for it. But starting from scratch takes a ton of responsibility. We're doing something right now in our elementary school on disc golf. Why are we doing it? Because it's a great COVID friendly experience, that where we live is an awesome array of options around us that our kids have no clue about. Why am I totally fine pouring hours into it? Because I'm doing it on the weekends already. It's not a big deal. It's just an excuse of how I can do it with kids. It's a perfect marriage between both of those things.
Yeah, no, I love it. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the concept of like like the genius or zone of genius, right? And so that's exactly what my goal for this Teach Plus One is. It's operating in a space where you're getting fulfilled. And so it's not like I have to do this other thing. You get to do this other thing, right? And so you walk away at the end of the day feeling that much more empowered and enlivened, and you're like, I love what I do because, yeah, like you said, it's an excuse to have a little bit of fun and do something that you're passionate about.
And
Sorry, Ken, that was like a long
yeah,
response.
but I mean, there's nothing like going to your kid's first event, and then going to school the next Monday. Like they just absolutely see you totally differently. And it's just unbelievable to be in that room when they're like, my teacher came, whether it's I went to the football game or whatever the case may be, it doesn't matter. I went to a dance recital in the elementary school. It's it's a beautiful thing to see that Monday morning, because all that outside work makes a huge difference in the classroom as well. You've just gained an ally, and whether it's someone that was already going to be an ally or someone that you need to kind of pull onto your side, it has huge dividends in the classroom. I'll say that from a teacher side. Do you feel like that's the same thing from the administrative side as well, or how do you portray that message to your teachers?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with you, right? When I was a teacher, I did it, and you're right, it helped build those relationships, and I still do it as an administrator. I make sure that I'm out at events, and not just because, oh, the principal is supposed to, but I will go to things that people aren't expecting me, and it does, and it builds connections not just with my students, but with my families and my school community. They view you as invested, and it helps. I mentioned earlier, I don't work and live in the same community. I am 43 miles away from my community. But the fact, like on a Saturday morning, I'm there for that community event, it just tells them, like, this guy loves us. He cares about us, and he's doing these things. Um, it just, I don't know. I think it just kind of echoes that sentiment that when we do this work, it's dual. There's a duality, right? We're pouring into the students and we're getting back from that, but then we're also getting to live within our purpose, and so we're being fulfilled. I don't mind. I know my wife is like, why do you do all of these different things? And it's like, yeah, some people might view it as a chore, but I really enjoy, like, yeah, we're gonna go to this basketball game, this dance recital, whatever it may be, right? So it's definitely a give and take.
Yeah, it is, and I think one of the keys, and it's obvious just hearing you talk about it, is being genuine about it. And it's the same when you're establishing relationships in the classroom. It pays dividends on your ability to instruct the students, your classroom management, and making the gesture is part of it, but also being genuine about it is key as well. So I want to kind of transition the conversation here and take advantage of having an experienced teacher and administrator here with us. So what is something that when you're walking through classrooms, whether it's an official observation or you're just touring around the school and you're popping your head in and out, what are things that you look for that tells you that students are genuinely engaged in the content and in the lesson? It's something that is a big topic in my district right now. I think coming out of the online COVID era, everybody's seeing more of a need for the engagement piece. And it was always there, but I think it kind of really gleaned light onto how disengaged students can be at times. And, so what are those things that you look for students that are genuinely engaged in a lesson and valuing the content that they're learning?
Yeah, so I'm in my classrooms all the time. So I think the very first thing is if they don't realize that I've come into the room, that's the first thing. Because normally when I walk, and I apologize to teachers, especially with my babies, right? I just saw you 5 minutes ago, and then when you see me, it's like, oh my God, Mr. Wood, like you just saw me. Um, but so that's the first thing. I think the other part is I want to know when I'm chatting with you because I don't just sit there and watch. Like I jump into the activities. And so I love listening to them explaining to me not just what they're doing, but like that reason why. Right? It's really easy to say, "Oh, well, we're blah blah blah." Like, okay, but what is the purpose of this? And they start explaining it. Oh, well, did you know? And they're sharing and they're fascinated. And I could see that excitement in them. Right? That tells me more. I'm not looking for the objective written on the board. Right? I never, and this is just me, I never ask to see your lesson plan when I pop in. Right? Because I want to see it, like not the paper. I want to see it happening live. And teachers can put on a show, and I'll be honest, like if you do put on a show, like kids let us know that, like that's like they're like, wait, why are you doing that all of a sudden? Right? But my thing is I jump into these activities with kids and I'm watching how they're interacting with whatever materials, and that tells me whether or not they're engaged. Right? If they're, I mean, obviously there's signs like my head's down, or I have no idea what's happening, clear signs. But then you also have compliance. Right? I'm doing this because you're told me to do it, but I really don't care or have any interest. And that becomes very clear in just having conversations. But it's when I see that them light up, and they get to share and they're excited to share, that tells me you're engaged, right? And I mean, I don't know. I think it just all depends. There's times I don't see it, and I'll try to pop out because I know I'm coming into lessons at different times. So I'll leave. I kind of do a round, and I'll try to come back later and see. And I'll share that with the teacher. Like, hey, they weren't really feeling it. Like, what could you have done a little bit differently, right? Like, I I've shared with teachers sometimes when I've done observations, and this is horrible. I'm like, but if I'm bored, the kids are bored. Like, and I know it's not a good thing, but if I start to fall asleep during your observation, like that's a bad thing. Like, I don't need you to just go through the steps. I want you to get creative. I want you to have fun. But going back to that last question, right? If you built those relationships with your students, whether it was through the after school program or whatever it may be, you know how to make that lesson interesting and engaging. But you can't do that if you're just coming in and teaching the lesson and then leaving at the end of the day and not making any attempt to connect with your students.
Yeah, and I think when you establish those genuine relationships, you can have a more successful compliance lesson because I mean, I would say to the kids, listen, this isn't going to be the best lesson of the day, but we have to do this because here's why. It's going to make us more successful when we get to this
Right.
point. When that's not common and you have that relationship, you can kind of like grind through those necessary,
Mm-hmm.
for lack of a better term, boring lessons that there's no way around it, especially when it's a rare occasion. So thinking about those conversations that you're having with students, because I always enjoyed watching administrators in my classroom have those conversations with my students, and watching the reaction of the administrators being impressed by how well a 10-year-old is speaking about what they're doing or what they're learning. what are some commonalities you see in the style of the lesson or the structure of the classroom where when you go into Mr. Rogers' classroom, like you're probably going to have great conversations with kids. Like what are those consistencies and commonalities you see across different teachers that create those environments for the students to thrive like that?
Yeah, the biggest thing is an opportunity for kids to be engaged with their learning. You're right. There's those lessons that like it sucks. Like today we're lacing up the skates, but tomorrow we get to go out on the ice, right?
Right.
So it's
That's a great analogy.
that lecture, that board. Like don't just sit there and speak to them. And if that's the type of teacher you are, I don't think kids are going to be that engaged. So normally when I know the classes that I'm walking into are opportunities where kids are, and that I was the same way. I want to be able to do, like you told me about it, but let me get to do it and let me be able to explain it and engage with my peers. A majority of the time, and I tell my teachers this all the time, this is how I used to teach. Like, I'm a facilitator of learning. I'm giving you a skill or I'm giving you some information, but I'm letting you run wild with it. And that's what I want to be able to see. You know, I know it may sound cliche, but coming in where it's like desks are in rows, right? Or I'm just I have worksheets, or I'm just taking notes from a PowerPoint. Like that's not engagement, right? I know it's going to be good when I know that students get to, well, not to keep using the word engage, but to get to engage with the material. I mean, it's pretty simple, and that could look a variety of ways, depending on the content, depending on the skill that you're learning. But I need to be able to produce. In fact, we have like norms. So I tell all my teachers, there's a lot of autonomy in my school. I'm not the one on the front line. I'm not the one in the classroom. I'm not doing the lessons. So I give my teachers a lot of autonomy on how they get to the end. But I say these are our norms, these are our non negotiables. And one of those non negotiables is that students have to produce every day. What are they producing? And in an opportunity, because one of the other norms is to engage with their peers. So I want to be able to interact. I want to be able to communicate in a meaningful way and produce something new with the information that I've learned that day. Like those are two of the non-negotiables. And it's like if that's happening, then I know that students are going to be engaged. And you can't have it the other way. Like if they're not engaged, they're not doing those things. It's at least that's what I've learned in my time in teaching and as an administrator.
To kind of tap into that, I mean, we're all pretty familiar with Danielson Model, and when first looking at the Danielson Model, I used to think that that was a class that almost operated as a teacher wasn't needed to be there at all. They got open the textbook, they read the pages, they just inherently knew what to do. They answered the questions, they put on a play, they solved a world problem. That was what the Danielson Model was. And when first introducing that earlier in my career, I recognized that, or I thought it was unrealistic to have a classroom that was well functioning and in the kids' hands. And in the last few years, Ken will be the model of this. The constant drive to put the ownership on the kids when appropriate, regardless of the age level. I think I'm at a benefit. Ken and I are both in a benefit in fourth and fifth grade classrooms where, what administrator coming from the middle school or high school doesn't expect them to be as capable as they are, but also the administrator that spent time in kindergarten can't believe how much growth happened between that range and to our level. So I'll say that I'm the complete benefit of that factor. But going back to the Danielson model, it seems like we've taken a shift to that being a realistic environment of what we're all striving for. And we all know, just like we don't all live in distinguished, we also don't live in the Danielson model. But there are times that you can pull out the best version of that for each and every lesson, whether it's the environment, whether it's the preparation, whether it's the in class experience, all of those features where the kids should be able to come in and you set routines that, with the first 5 minutes of math are known, or what homeroom looks like. You can have them come in and legitimately not need to say anything because they all have a system in place that they get accomplished. I think one of the components that I'm always fascinated by an administrator with a teacher, you know, in that scenario, one of the things that we always hear is, I want to have more impact in classrooms. That's why I moved up to a bigger position. I want to affect more kids, or I want to train teachers to be better at their role. But in that situation, you're asking them to take risks, to feel uncomfortable, to do these things that may not be natural to them. How do you balance a conversation where you actually have teacher training that you'd like to impart, but also be sensitive to their emotional status because you are a supervisor, the dynamics of the classroom that you don't see all day every day, those type attributes of how do you lead towards a classroom you know is where we want to be, but also respect where they're at that moment.
So, it's funny you mentioned this. So at the beginning of every year, so I started doing this, I think 3 years ago now. Um, Somebody was talking about like, people stop waiting for permission and just do, right? And you keep hearing it over and over again. And so I took the opposite route. I said, well, if people are going to keep asking for permissions, I'm going to just give them permission at the beginning of the year. So I came up with my principal permissions, right? And there's five of them. And so like the first one is like, I was like, no, I want you to be like innovative. You have permission to be innovative. If you find a workshop or something, a conference, something that you want to do, please come and see me. And I'm going to try my very best to make that thing happen. And then, so therefore, then I also then want you to take risks, because I'm guessing you've learned something. So now I want you to take some risks. And the third one then is I give you permission to fail. And that's a huge one. And you can't just say it. A lot of people say it. Well, yeah, you have permission to fail. But I need to let my teachers know that. And it takes time, just like teachers with their students. You build the relationships and things like that. I need to build that time to show them, if you struggle, like, I've got you. Let's sit down and have a conversation about what went wrong. How could you have done things different? And so I've redone my entire evaluation system where it's not punitive at all. It is a growth evaluation system, just like what we're trying to build with students. Because it blows my mind that we do things for kids, but then we don't do it for our teachers. So I'm like, no, 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 no. That's how we're gonna operate, because that's what I want you to do for your kids. Right? You got to model it. The fourth one is I give you permission to have fun. Right? Like, don't be so worried about all the things that could potentially go wrong, because a lot of times what we know is in that mess is when the best learning takes place. So have a little bit of fun, right? Like, step outside of your comfort zone and see what happens. And then the last one is just permission to love, right? Love on your kids appropriately, of course, right? But to build those relationships. So I say that at the beginning of the year, like, you have my permission to do these things. And it's interesting because I remember a group of teachers. They went off to a workshop. It was around Minecraft, and they were like, there's this pilot that they were running, and we were just wondering if the school could join it because we think it would be really great for the kids. And I was like, yeah, no, like, I think that would be great if you guys think that it's going to have some benefits. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. They're like, okay, good, because we already signed us up. And I started laughing. They're like, we figured you were going to say yes, but we just thought we'd ask. And it was like in that moment that I realized, like, yeah, they know, like, it's okay. It's okay to do these things. And so I hope, Matt, like, to go back to your question, I've realized it's easy for a principal to say, I want to see X, Y, and Z. I believe these are the things that should be happening in a school. But you have to create, like I said earlier, those systems and procedures to make that happen, right? I have to let them know we're not going to get there by accident. You got to take risks. You're going to have to build some things, and I'm not going to punish you, as you mentioned, like the exemplary or the level fours or whatever it may be. I don't do that anymore. I said, what is your goal for the year? Where do you want to grow as a teacher? And let's work together to make that thing happen. And at the end of the year, we check in on it. Did you reach your goal? Right? Did you get better? And if you didn't, right, it's as much as my fault as it is yours. So now we say, well, what can we do differently next year? I'm not going to punish you for not making your goal. Like, that's ridiculous. And it's the same thing, right? What I believe we should be doing with our kids. We talk about a growth mindset all the time, but do we actually live within that? Right? And so that's just, I mean, that's how I approach it. and luckily I'm in a single site charter school. So I've been with my company for, geez, 9 years now. I didn't even realize it's been that long. Uh, but they let me go, right? Because the results are there. And so this is kind of like I mentioned earlier, now what I hope to formulate in other spaces. And I know not all districts or all leaders or teachers have, that autonomy, but this is, I believe, what we need to create if we really want to see education be transformed. And so that's what I do. My school is my sandbox. It's my playground.
And that's just the most beautiful perspective. I mean, I think it's that classic like player's coach or coach's coach. Like it is you are a teacher's principal of every attribute. Like this, you are the type of leader that you're like, hey, I have free reign to be creative and create a classroom that I envisioned when I was a freshman in college deciding that I was going to go into education, right? Without those limitations, the red flags, the diving deep into curriculum to know what the expectations are before I really cared about the state testing, all of those things weather creativity out of us, which then in part weathers it out of the kids as well by creating those. And I love those five principles. I think that is phenomenal. Simple, straightforward, but just it's the best way to perceive to associate how education should run. But I would also imagine that you needed to do some work with your community to kind of the parents and the staff even to kind of pull in that, you know what, I'm giving them these leniences. I'm giving, you know what, this may not sound that they should be doing Minecraft in school. They may not, it may not sound that this should be a priority. Just trust us that it's all good, or that I'm taking the hit if it's, oh, but we didn't do our 2.5 hours worth of core instruction. We infused it with 3D modeling instead. Those type things. What do you do to get your families and community on your side to allow, I mean, they're the stakeholders, right? They're the ones that really you need to, in the business model, appease. The product in the long run usually does it for you, but seeing it in the foresight in that moment beforehand is the challenge. So what do you do with communities specifically?
So I'll be honest, like it freaked people out, and it wasn't from the ground running, right? We had teachers, we had students and families who left because they're like, this guy, I don't know what he's up to. I mean, I was the third principal in 3 years when I came in, and so they were weary about me then. They were weary about these newfangled ideas that I had, and so we did have some who left. But I think what was helpful is that I remained consistent, right? I said, this is why I'm here. I told them then, I said, I'm coming in. I have a goal for the school, and I'm not leaving until we reach that point. And I kept being consistent with my message everywhere I went. Like I mentioned earlier, I embedded myself in every aspect of the community that I possibly could and consistently communicated that. So, it helped because people knew who I was and what I was about, but it didn't really take hold until they started seeing those results, right? And when I came in, and I share this story all the time, my school was slated to close. That's why they brought me in. They were like, we're hoping that you could do something about this. The first year did not go according to plan because I went textbook, right? Like I did everything that you're supposed to do, and nothing changed. And so that's when we said we got to do things differently. And that was the year that was probably the roughest, because they were like, we're supposed to go this way. The textbook says we're supposed to go this way, and you're going that way. Like, how are we going to end up where we're supposed to be? And I said, trust me. And a lot of people are like, no, I'm not going to trust you. Like, I need a job, I need security. Like, I'm going to go somewhere else. And the few who did, and we wrote it out, and we saw these beautiful results. And all of a sudden, those families who left, they're coming back, and they're like, oh wait, like there's some amazing things happening. So I think the biggest takeaway, and the thing that I share with people, it's like, it's not easy, it's not pretty, it sounds great now, but during that time, I mean, I to be honest, I didn't even know if it was going to work. I felt it. I believed in it. But I was like, I don't know if this is going to work. It makes sense, right? It's not written about. These are things that you can't really measure. But as an educator, it's like these things make sense. And if I'm going to fail, then I'm going to fail doing the things that I believe in and the things that I'm passionate about, the things that I think should be happening, right? And so I did it, and it definitely paid off. Where in hindsight, I was like, had I done everything that I was supposed to do, like the school wouldn't be open anymore, right? And so I don't know. I think as a leader, you have to be consistent. And I know my dean and I don't know if he'll listen to this, but we butted heads. He was at the school for years before I came in, and he loved the kids. He loves the school, and he was weary of me. And so when I started doing all these different things, he was very like, no, no. And now we are yin and yang. Like we operate together beautifully. And that's what he told me. He said, we know what we're going to get. You are consistent. We know who you are. We know why you're here. And I think that is the most powerful thing. It's like I haven't changed over the last 6 years in this building, and we've done some crazy things, but you know why. And that's always important. You know the why, the purpose behind the actions. I'm sorry, some of my responses are long.
No, no, I love it. What I love about what I've been hearing with our last two pieces that you've been sharing is you were talking about how you want teachers to take risks with their students. So you created an environment for them to feel as though they could take risks, with those upfront permissions. But then you followed that up by saying you have the support of your superiors to have autonomy in your building. Well, they're providing you that same atmosphere to be able to take those risks. It's a top down model that's working because you're all traveling in the same direction of you want people to take risks, you want them to do what they think is best for students or for teachers or for a principal. And it creates a unity in that direction you're going, and it just follows up to what you just shared about going the way that you're not supposed to according to the textbook. And I'm in an interesting position as a coach where I get to see a lot of conversations at the classroom level, the building level, the district level. And a lot of times I think like we're all not traveling in the same direction. We're talking about this instructional strategy, but we're taking this approach from a leadership perspective. They conflict. You're not modeling, you're not following exactly what you want to see happen in the classroom. And you're speaking to how when all of that is in line, it creates such a great result. And so, I would assume assessments, data, state tests, something in there is going to fall in that line of some of what was a problem before and what you could measure as success now. How do what is your relationship and perspective on that data piece from from your position, but also how your teachers and students are interacting with data and assessments and how that plays into the
So
classroom?
data is super important, right? I mean, you always talk about like data driven. I don't say, I say data informed, right? So you need to have that data. The part that bothers me is when it's like high stakes, standardized, like that's the part that bothers me. I have no issue with assessments. I have no issue with collecting data because that's what lets you know, is this thing working or not? It's when you say, okay, everything is going to boil down to this one assessment, right? That's where I have that issue. And so I think kind of just anchoring all conversations in data, like I meet with my teachers, and again, this is just how I approach things. So I meet with clusters every 2 weeks. So if you're in fifth grade, I'm meeting with you twice a month, and I'm just saying, how are things going in your classroom? But you can't just say, oh yeah, yeah, they're good. Like, show me the data. What data do you have that can show me whether things are going well or not? And again, nothing is ever punitive. It's, if it's going great, great, what are you doing and how can we continue that? And if it's not going so well, what can we change to fix that? Right? And so teachers get really comfortable talking about data and utilizing data, as they're, from anything from formative assessments to to summative assessments. but it's also having this idea of students need to know where they're at. And so I'm really big, and I used to do this with my own students of, do you know where you're at? So can you track your own progress? Can you track your own growth? I mean, so we utilized map growth a lot, right? And so it's like, okay, well, I'm at a 189. Okay, my goal is, I don't know, a 195 or whatever. Well, okay, but what does that mean? What do you need to do to get there? Well, here are these skills. Well, have you mastered those skills? Like, let's have a chart on your table. Like, here are your skills. And as you're working on your skills, are you, tracking your progress? Because now students know, like, hey, I'm still struggling on this skill. Like, now you know where to focus. And to me, that's what data does. It just tells you what you need to focus on in order to get to that goal. And I remember sitting in interviews, in between, and they're like, well, how did you get these great results when the rest of the district was struggling? I was like, well, data. Like, it's pretty straightforward, right? We assess our students, we take those, and we kind of figure out what we need to do. But it's not, and again, it's just, for me, it's not, data's not the scary thing. Assessments aren't the scary thing. It's when you utilize those tools to be punitive. It's when you utilize them as high stakes, and it just, right, when we think about, I guess, data, right, it's not just paper and pencil, right? How are your students showing you that they understand the materials? And Matt, I think you referenced this earlier. We do a lot of things that are convenient to us, but because they're convenient to us, we place barriers for our students. So yeah, it's a lot easier for me to give you a Scantron, right? Do we still use Scantrons? Um, then it's like, okay, well, choose, like, whatever. We've read this novel. How are you going to demonstrate your understanding of the theme of this novel to me? Well, I want to create a sculpture. Like, that is a vastly different rubric from the kid who loves to write and wants to write an essay, vastly different from the kid who wants to create a multimedia presentation. But if they can demonstrate their understanding to you, then allow them to do that. It's our job to figure out, well, how do we take all of these different pieces and collect the data from that to say, yeah, the student has demonstrated mastery. It just, again, it bothers me because it makes sense. But in the bigger picture, there's that standardized assessment. Like, and how do we make that fit in there? And sometimes it works. I mean, our kids have been showing some tremendous gains, and of course, then we hit the pandemic. But I remember we went from the 18th percentile in math to the 48th percentile in about 3 years. And it wasn't like we were doing something special or this, like, I don't know, this secret recipe. We just gave students an opportunity to engage with math in a variety of ways. And the biggest pushback is like, well, that's not what they're going to see on the test. Like, no, but the skills are skills, right? Like, it's going to transfer in some capacity. Like, I hate the fact, like, we do all this fun stuff, and then at the end, yeah, you got to take the standardized assessment. So one day, right, when I'm ruling education, we'll change all of that.
We're looking forward to that moment.
Definitely. And yeah, I think everybody is. And I often said, and this was advice given to me when I was very early in my career, a test grade should never be a surprise.
No,
You should
no.
never be surprised what a student scores on a test. And if you're running a classroom where students are engaged and invested in themselves, they shouldn't be surprised either. And it was something that I really took serious. And one, it was for, so the two sides of that. One, I needed to stay informed on my students, so constant check-ins, whether that's conferences, it's small group instruction, it's quick exit tickets, formative assessments built into the center of the into the middle of the lesson. And then taking that one step further, it was, how do I involve the students in it? So anytime I could use an online tool that was automatically grading for me to have that data quickly accessible, when appropriate and as often as possible, I made the data available to the students right away so they could see how they did, and so that they were informed and they were aware of how they're doing on that particular skill. But then also involving them in, okay, we have a test coming up in social studies, or we have a project due in science. It's a week out. What are you going to do between now and then? What's your study plan? What's your work plan? And I would have them, we would just kind of map out how many days are between now and then. And I would tell them, listen, if you have activities on Wednesday night where you don't have time, put an X through it. Don't study that night. You don't need to study for 7 days to be successful if you're engaging in class and you're doing what I ask you to do in class. And so, it got to the point where tests really weren't a surprise in my classroom. And I would have students that typically struggle. Maybe they did a little bit better. And then the next unit, they fill out that sheet, they bomb the test. And I say, what happened? And they're like, I didn't do anything that I planned I was going to do. Good. It wasn't a surprise. So, that piece of data has such an important part in it. And I think so often teachers get bogged down by the word data and what it means and how it can really look in the classroom. So, Matt, you're still in the classroom. How are you using data in your classroom, and how are your students developing a relationship with their own data? Or what could you do different?
I would say, first off, I love data informed, and when you bring up the question data and you're talking about it, yeah, it's sending shivers down my spine, because it seems so sterile when talking about data. Like I just want to sit there and justify and say, oh, this kid really tried, or this kid was up late, or got sick, or has all these scenarios to justify their score. Um, because sometimes, I mean, we've all heard the statistics. You can make data reflect whatever you want it to. But I think the most powerful way that I use data is goal setting for kids. They may not understand what this number, as you were saying, 185 to 196, they may not have an understanding of what that truly means, but they can at least recognize areas that they need to improve in that will lead to that. And one of my favorite things to kind of pull from is, when they get into the mucky, uncomfortable stuff, like almost to go full circle in this conversation, they're willing to go and run through walls because it's very evident in my classroom that we're not excited about standardized testing, but my kids usually do incredibly well, even though it doesn't match what my classroom looks like the entire school year. And the reason why is because we created, as you mentioned, skills are skills, learning is learning. You understand the concepts. Hopefully, that we've done enough that you can diagram a question and identify what you need to answer in this very boring multiple choice question. But at the end of the day, my kids, because of the relationship that we've created, because of the learning environment, are willing to climb mountains, even if they are miserable mountains to climb at the end of the day, because of their commitment, because of my commitment in them. And it's not that I'm enticing them. My scores, as you mentioned, Charles, it's kind of like if you do good teaching, and what the kids need, you don't really have to worry about it. I'm not saying ignore data. I'm just saying that there's an element of you can kind of take the pressure off yourself and say it's really difficult to draw that line between, hey, I'm going to be really creative and try things out and say that's going to lead to success, but you just have to trust that that's how it's going to work. And that's probably the hardest point on your end, to say like, hey, I'm going to justify this, but I don't know how to explain the correlation. It's that intrinsic motivation paired with just good teaching and knowledge of skills. To answer your question, data right now in my room, as I mentioned, is goal setting. It's, what, I want to do better. I know that right now we're doing a program called Spring Math, and it is a program that it covers um, multiplication, addition, subtraction, those type skills to the mastery level. And it's one of those things that, what, the goal is one more fact today than you had yesterday. And there's going to be dips and there's going to be big jumps, and that's natural. But they graph every day, they record every day, they write what they had before, they know what they scored, and they can view it, and that can be the way that they push forward. But in all those things, like I, I guess I am very detached from grades. I'm very detached from data, honestly, which hopefully doesn't come off wrong. But I just trust that, you know what, the curriculum director chose a curriculum that you guys believe in, or the administration has a program you believe in. I'm going to teach the heck out of it to fidelity as best I possibly can, leading to engagement. And I'm going to believe that it's going to lead in that scope and sequence to growth.
Matt, if I may, so I think it's interesting, as you mentioned earlier, the idea of coming up with like the reasons behind like the excuses, and I think again that stems from this fear of like that punitive, right? Like when we did assessments at the beginning of the year, our data was horrible, right? And when I put it up, the teachers are like, "Yeah, but and I said, "Guys, like I'm not upset. Like I knew this was going to be the case, and that's okay." I said, "This isn't about who you are. All this is doing is telling us what we need to do to get where we want to be. That's all this is. So I don't need you to say, well, the pandemic and all, like I get it. Like that's not what we're here for. But on the other side of that, and I've heard this phrase, like they say, if it's predictable, it's preventable, right? Like if you know that this kid is always going to, like, why? Right, if that data is always looking poorly, if that student's failing to, why, like what, we know it's going to happen, so what can we do differently? And that's all we talk about. It's not about looking back and saying, oh, this is why, like what can we do now moving forward? What's done is done. And I think we spend a lot of time in education trying to, as you said earlier, trying to justify why we are where we are, instead of just saying, okay, it is what it is. How do we move forward?
Yeah, I often relate it to, if you follow baseball at all, or even, some of the other sports now, the analytics versus the, there you go, versus, I got some bobbleheads over there, versus the old school coaches that say, oh, I'll watch a guy for 10 minutes and I'll tell you whether he's going to be an all-star or not. And, I think anyone that can take a logical standpoint is, the blend is where the magic is at. You use data to show you over time how a player performs, or over time how a player fits into a lineup. But at the same time, you have to look at the whole picture. You have to know them as a player. You have to know what situations they're good in, all those different pieces. And it's the same with teaching. Teaching is an art. We have teachers that, have been in this game for a long time, well before there was consistent and meaningful and, relevant data. But at the same time, all right, let's take your craft, let's take your expertise, and let's just add in this component where you know a little bit more about your students, and more relevant data and more recent and current data to really bring all the pieces together. So normally we would jump into our lesson lens here, Charles, but I know equity in education is a huge thing that you're passionate about. So honestly, I'd rather skip the lesson lens for time's sake, and I'd rather talk about what I think is a much more important topic with equity in education. So why don't you just share with us, why that's a passion of yours, and kind of, what direction you're taking that in.
Yeah, so the story I share all the time. I love it when I watch these like keynotes and they're like, "Yeah, I was that kid in detention. I was always in trouble," and I wasn't. Like I was the epitome of what a student should be. I rocked it out, but I realized as got into education, there was a reason for that, and that's because education, my experience, was crafted for students like me, right? I had a lot of peers who are very gifted, very talented. My brother in that same vein, but they struggled in school, and I could never understand why. It wasn't that they didn't have talents or skills. It was that the system that we were in, the environment that we were in, wasn't built for them. And so when I became an educator, I said, that's not right. That's not fair. Like it shouldn't be built for just a few, the small percentage of students. How do we make sure that it's, all students are being successful? And, it was a humbling thing. Like, yeah, I was really awesome, but in reality, I wasn't any better than anybody else. And so that was what I wanted to do. As I got into education, I started with my bilingual students. That's where I started. And it's like, how do I make them fit? How do I make sure that they're successful? And again, as I just continued on, it was again, that's what equity is about. How do we make sure that everybody has the tools in order so that they could be successful? I get so infuriated and frustrated when people say things, but it's again out of convenience. I can't do something because it's not a convenience for me. It's like, it's not about you. Like, we became educators to make sure students are successful. And we say that it's in all of our mission statements, all students, all students, all students. But when you sit there and say, well, I'm going to do this, and I refuse to budge, then you're not living in that. You're saying, I'm okay making sure that this group of students are successful, and sorry, the rest of you. Like, and I'm sorry, like, no, I'm not sorry. If that's who you are as an educator, then like, you are not an educator. You're failing what it is for us as pure educators of what it means. Like, that is why we entered into this craft, because we want every single student in our classroom to be successful. And so now I do this work, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DEI, and just I want to make sure, that if you are doing this work, that every single student is going to be, or I should say, every student has the opportunity to be successful in your classroom. I mean, for whatever reason, they may not be, but if you've given them the opportunities, if you've opened those doors for every single student, then you're doing your job. And so that is really right what is launched, what I talked about earlier, like the counter narrative. Like, let's stop having all these I'm tired of the negative conversations around especially our marginalized groups. Like I said earlier, the predictable, it's preventable. Like, stop saying like, oh well, they're the reasons, they're the reasons. Like, there's a lot of good happening. And if we have this deficit mindset, then that is how we're going to treat a group of students. That's how those groups of students are going to view themselves. Like, we need to break that, right? Hence the podcast, right? Like, it's just my workshops. I do a lot of speaking about these things. It's just, I don't know. It's just, it infuriates me that there are so many people out there who are like, yeah, no, I'm an educator. I believe all students, but do you really? Do you really? And so, I don't know. I don't know if that answered your question. I just started
So
getting
so
upset.
depending, it does, and I love just seeing how passionate you are about it. As a teacher, depending where you are teaching, your grade level, that group of students that might not fit the mainstream of your classroom is very different. By demographics, by just where you're
Hmm.
located. Even in
Yeah.
my district, we have 7 elementary schools, and the special ed programs are different by different elementary schools. So even in a small district, those programs are different, which creates a different dynamic in your classroom. So my question is, as a classroom teacher, how do I step back and reflect on what I do to ask myself, am I delivering quality instruction to the the majority, the model that most of the students fit, or am I truly creating an atmosphere where all of my students have the opportunity for success? Is there anything that we can do to kind of reflect and see that on ourselves?
So, I mean, Ken, you're right. It starts, I think, with the reflection pieces. But I think the more important, it's okay to reflect, but I think one of the things that we have to understand is that we all have these like implicit bias, and it's really really hard to recognize just kind of when I'm just sitting there internally, because I think, as we've mentioned earlier, there's this inherent need to kind of justify, right? Well, I'm doing, yeah, but so what I would always suggest is to, and when I do this work with people, we do courageous conversations. In fact, there's and now I'm trying to remember, there's a group out of San Francisco. I'm trying to remember their name, but if you're going to do this work, there's a card deck. It's a deck of cards. It's and I'll send it to you guys afterwards. So if you want to share it, but it just really forces you to think about things. But it's when you're engaging in that conversation, a lot of times it's having that thought partner, somebody. I talk about having brave conversations and safe spaces, right? So finding groups of individuals that you could have these very honest conversations with, and for them to be able to call you out on things. And it's okay. Like, because if you're really intentional about saying, I want to make sure that I'm doing the right things, it's going to be messy, it's going to hurt, it's going to be rough. Like, it's not easy. There's a lot of times people talk about like, well, I want to make sure I'm ready. Like, you're never going to be ready. Just dive in, and you're going to make mistakes. but that's the only way you're ever going to make any sort of progress. And so reflections are good. And so there's a lot of things or tools out there, where you could take tests or do things like that. But what I have found is we try to justify immediately because we don't like to be uncomfortable. We don't like to think that, that we could have these biases, but we do. So having that thought partner, to be able to hold you accountable is huge. And so I know in my Twitter spaces and social media spaces, I have a bunch of thought partners in a bunch of different areas that I just say, hey guys, like this is something I'm struggling with right now. Like, give me feedback, right? And you have to be vulnerable enough to receive that and then process that and say, how can I move forward with that? But it's definitely having those brave conversations in those safe spaces, because I think a lot of times we like to have safe conversations in safe spaces. I do a lot of Twitter chats, but a lot of Twitter chats are safe conversations in safe spaces because we're all like, oh, we're all friends and we're all saying the same thing. But go and have that truthful conversation and then bring it back to your safe space, right? Or step out into an uncomfortable space, a brave space, and say, I'm going to try to do something a little bit different. And it's about being vulnerable and being transparent and willing to accept that maybe what you thought was right isn't. And I know I live in that space all the time, and I tell people I'm not an expert. I'm on my own journey, right? And that's okay. But it's being okay with not having all the answers, about constantly growing. So I don't know. I don't know if that helps.
I guess my I'll ask a challenging question to you, right? So
Yeah.
in this in this situation, like I feel like I can have those brave conversations with colleagues and other educators because we kind of understand this code of professionalism, this code of I'm asking a tough question that I am maybe narrow-minded about. I'm welcome for you telling me if I am, but I know that you're going to be respectful back to me. And I think that there's an element of having these brave conversations at the professional level. But what does it look like to go from professional level to actually creating a classroom that represents equity? Because I think I, as a person, can, and I think it's a beautiful thing going on right now where there are plenty of movements that represent people having the voice and what they deserve in many different facets. But when the the movement goes a little bit quieter, we as educators kind of model the society of inclusiveness and equity in the classroom. We model how we want our kids to grow up and create the world to be. And if I'm an educator that may not be in as tune or have those professional level conversations, what are some of those suggestions you have to take that into the classroom to to create the environment that represents what we want the world to be?
So I think first of all, it starts in, we talk about safe spaces. So it starts with creating or changing your classroom into that safe space. And that stems, to be cliche, of building rapport with your students. And I quote Sloan all the time. So Sloan P. Joseph, she and I had a show together, or conversation. And she said, we got to stop talking about relationships and start talking about rapport, because a relationship is just simply like, a connection that people have, but rapport is built on that mutual trust, right? And so if we can get to that point with our students, then you can start to have those brave conversations with your students. One, as an educator, to say, how can I be better as an educator, right? What are some areas that I'm not having you to feel welcome in this space? One. But I think, as you're saying, is having that depiction of the bigger world. And I'll be honest, this is something that I'm struggling with within my building right now. Is that, so we are on the far west side of Chicago. We're like 99% African American. And so it was very easy, right? It was a very safe space to say, oh, we need to make sure that when we're having conversations around race, that people are being represented. And that was an easy transition. but there's this big push now around, you know, gender inclusivity, right? Sexual orientation, and all of a sudden it's like, ooh, I don't know. Like, should we be teaching our kids about that? I'm like, why wouldn't we? Like, I'm not promoting something. I'm not saying, oh, you should go out and live this certain type of lifestyle. What I'm trying to do is create children who know how to operate in the world outside. And that is the world that we live in. I don't care whether or not you agree with it. You don't have to agree with it, but we should be teaching our students to be respectful about the people who are around them. Right. And that is what I found myself in. And so every time people are like, I don't know if we should be, is like, is that what you're saying? Like that our kids shouldn't respect somebody because they're different from them, that they have a different, I don't know, orientation or philosophy or whatever it may be. Like, is that what you're saying? And it's really hard in those times to be like, no, like I think my kids should be rude. Like nobody's going to say that. But that for me is what it boils down to is, we had a parent. So we started doing this work not too long ago. And it was a lot just about, LGBTQ. And I said, this is a safe space. And for the first time in a long time, like kids started hearing that. And all of a sudden we had some students who were like, okay, I'm going to come out. And I had parents, you made my daughter gay. It didn't work that way. Like this is who she was, and we've created a safe space now where she can be who she truly is. And if that is who she wants to be, I can't tell you how to raise your child, but I'm going to respect her decisions or his decisions. And it's really starting to become impactful because now we even have a teacher who has said, okay, this is who I am. Right. And I think it's just going to take some time. But I think, again, if we found ourselves in this, just today, a teacher had a mug. It said, I promise to teach my babies to love your babies. And I was like, that's all what this is about. Like, it's not what I agree with or I disagree with. It's not my personal stance. It's not about I'm promoting one thing over another. I just want to make sure that my kids know how to operate in a larger world and get along with people. Like we've seen the chaos, with the past administration and the transition, and it's not about politics. We just saw the chaos in this country, and that's like, how do we fix that? Right. And it's just about respecting the other person. I don't have to agree with you. I don't have to love you, even though I should. Right. It's about respecting you, even though we're different. And that is what I think that we should be doing with our students. And if you disagree with that, I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't know why you would, but I think to answer your question, Matt, that's how you create that. I'm just trying to teach you to respect people who are different from you.
And I think a big part of that is how to engage in and facilitate and participate in mature conversations where I am comfortable enough to say, Charles, I don't, but I disagree with you. Here's why I disagree with you. Here's why I feel the way I feel. I understand your perspective, but this is my perspective and this is how I feel and this is what I think. It's there's such a difference between that and what we're seeing on a national scale right now, where there is no civil discourse from one side to the other. You have to take a side, and if you do, you're the enemy of the other. I mean, that's what our kids are seeing. That's what we're seeing as adults from the top down, from our national politics and just and down the local politics. And I think I completely agree with what you're saying about just learning to respect people, learning to operate in a world where you can work respectfully, understand different perspectives, whether or not you agree with those perspectives, but just creating an atmosphere where you can have a civil conversation where you can share how you disagree and then you come to a common ground where you both can move forward. And I think it's so important for us to create those atmospheres for more of the community to engage in, but also most importantly for the kids to see that, wow, you can have two people that have completely different opinions engage in a conversation and agree to disagree, agree to mutually respect each. There should be some sort of positive outcome, even if it's not a perfect outcome. But just seeing that conversation, I think is so important. So I don't want to cut this part off, but I did want to. I knew that was something you were passionate about, so I wanted to throw the lesson lens away and talk about that. But I do want to hit you with our Matt. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just have one more question related to this, and then we'll jump into the next segment, last segment. I feel like right now, and I'd love to get your input. Two different scenarios: a experienced teacher who likes control, is maybe uncomfortable about the idea of, almost what you said, like, I feel comfortable to talk about racial confusion and discomfort, but the sexual orientation is uncomfortable. I want to control the conversation, and I see this going way bigger than what I can handle, as well as the new teacher, and I'm using very passionate about it, that maybe doesn't have as much resistance to seeing that middle. Like, what would your suggestions be to those type people to say, you still have to facilitate a classroom that doesn't necessarily represent your views, but allow each side to feel comfortable to bring equity into their classroom and into that
I,
conversation?
I, so Matt, I think you've been hanging out at my building. That's exactly my as you said it, like I was like, yep, I know exactly who you're talking about. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think it comes back to this idea, like it's not about our personal philosophies and stances, right? Like I have that teacher who is like gung ho, like this is all about like, oh, we're community. Not it's that like I'm trying to put it in a nice way. But she, this teacher is very much like, this is what we're going to talk about. Like, every time I go into the classroom, it's like, for example, on Halloween, it's character day, and it was like talking about, cultural appropriation, and so it was like, yeah, don't dress up as a Native American. That's wrong. And I was like, this is okay. Yes. But like, where is this at in your lesson? Like, how does this fit in? How does this blend in? And so, it's always about to say these things are important, but it has to be, I guess, grounded in what is our main purpose here, right? Like I need to make sure that your child is addressing the skills, like we talked about those non-negotiables, right? These are the skills, these are the standards, and if you blend those things in, then okay, right? If it's part of, but that cannot be the main focus. And it's also understanding that balance. It's whereas you may be far like way into that, like to say, okay, you know what, these students may not necessarily be entirely understanding, parents, the community. So you kind of have to ease into things, whereas on the other side, where it's like I'm not doing that at all, like you have to understand, in order for your children to operate like we talked about earlier, you have to start making that transition. But I think that's then important. Again, I just think about myself as I try to create that space within the school to say, where do we stand as a whole, right? I'm not, yes, like if this is who you are, like we're going to be welcoming and inviting, but I'm not using every opportunity, every meeting to push a personal agenda. That is not why we're here. And so it's about finding that balance, and it's doing so respectfully. Like I love the fact that you're passionate about this. I love that you want to make sure that our students are not being, culturally appropriating, other cultures, I guess, or appropriating other cultures. But like, why are we doing this? Like, where's the purpose of that? And I think it's just finding that balance of saying, yes, it's okay, but we need to dial it back and focus on this thing. And then on the other side, it's how do we make sure that we're moving over, and it's all about balance, and it's never about that it's wrong, right? Like, oh, we can't teach those things. I mean, I've had this conversation. I have some people in my building, we were putting up some paintings, right? I want to make sure that my students see themselves, and so we have all these paintings, right? And so, well, as I mentioned earlier, we're 99% African American, but now there's some Hispanic paintings up, and I was questioned, why are you putting those up? We don't have any students who are Hispanic. I said, no, we don't, but we have some staff members who are Hispanic. And guess what? When our students leave our building, they're going to interact with individuals who are Hispanic, right? Like, again, I want them to be respectful, and I don't want my kids to be that person who's ignorant when they encounter somebody who's different from them, right? And so it's like, it's finding that balance. It's like, no, I'm not pushing anything. This is something that I want you to be able to understand, and it's there, but it's just, I don't know. I don't know if I've answered the question. It's delicate. And it's something, to be honest, I'm working through. I'm trying to figure out where is that perfect balance, and in reading the larger world in which we operate, to say, okay, how far do we go with this? But it's definitely finding that balance and not ever pushing a personal agenda.
I think that's one of the most important things you just said about not pushing that personal agenda. It's about the students. It's about educating them, preparing them, like you said. So our last segment of the show is called the exit ticket. Same four questions we ask every guest every week. Question number one: what is the best thing a teacher can do to make a student's school experience better?
Love on them appropriately. I always have to say appropriately. We live in crazy times. Um, but just love on them. Build those relationships, connect with them. It's not, we always talk about, it's not like what you teach, it's not the lessons that they're going to remember, it's how you made them feel. And that's it. Like, just make that experience amazing by making school relevant and interesting and engaging. And yeah, like that's the key.
It's beautiful. You obviously have many inspirations, many things that come to mind to lead to your passion, but it all comes down to advice you've received. Can you kind of share maybe the best piece of advice you've gotten that you think of frequently? And it could be from a colleague, a supervisor, or even a student that keeps you keeping your mind right.
Yeah. So I guess that there's a few things. So in one of the my keynotes that I talk about, so my grandfather, when I was younger, he told me this thing. He was like, that people are always going to judge you by the way you look. It's up to you to prove them right or not. Um, and so that has been this like kind of driving force behind everything I do. Um, Depending on where you see me or how you see me, so like you can't see it now, but I have like tattoos all over. And so it's like the whole Hamish Brewer sort of thing. It's like, yeah, like people are going to judge you. Um, so I there's been this passion behind me to say I want to be the best that I could possibly be, like, so that way whoever you are, whoever you're judging me, like I know who I'm going to be. um and I don't know if it's a single piece of advice, but it's always been this idea of just like, if you do the right thing, everything's going to be okay, right? Like, and that's all I try to do. Like, as I'm doing all of this work, I'm just trying to do what is right. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't work out, like, at least I know at the end of the day I did what was right. And it's that simple. Like, I'm in education to educate students. And so that is what I do. I make sure I take care of my people, my staff, and my students. And if I know at the end of the day that's what I've done, then I'm okay with that. And so it's just do what's right.
Yeah, that's perfect. So the school year goes in waves, as we know, right? There are definite challenges, whether it's conferences or report card time. What is something that you think every educator should hear to help them power up to push through those moments of struggle?
Can I use my principal permissions?
Yeah, seriously.
I just, yeah, I mean, when we do a lot of circles, and so we just have honest conversation. So like when I know my staff is struggling, and we did this, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, we just sat down and we had a circle, community circle, right? And there was a lot of tears, even from me, right? And we were honest with one another. But the next day, like, a lot of that stress and that strife was gone. And it's not about saying the perfect thing, it's about knowing we're all in this together. Like, let's get that out and communicate with one another, and you shed that weight, right? And so I don't know if it's like, oh, I love quotes, don't get me wrong, but I just don't know if there's a single quote that's always going to do it. I just think it's community. Like, let's come together and know that we need those moments to laugh together, to cry together, and it builds that solidarity, and it's that energy that pushes us through.
Definitely. I totally agree with that. And from a place of kind of authenticity of working towards that common goal. So I almost asked you this question probably right in the beginning of the show because we were kind of on this topic, but it's easy to fall into a pattern of kind of repetitive teaching and facilitating in your classroom. What do you think separates teachers who constantly seek change, innovation, and new teaching strategies to innovate their classrooms?
I don't. Okay, I'll say it. Like I hate curriculums, like programs. That's what I hate. When I first started teaching, I had nothing. Like every lesson I created was built from scratch, and so I built my lessons for the students that I had, and that I think made all the difference. So when you have, I always am. I dislike it when the district people come in and they're like, "So what's your curriculum?" I'm like, "Well, we have the set standards, and here are all of our resources." Yeah, but what's your curriculum? You're not. That is what a curriculum is. You're asking about what program we use, right? And so you want me to say we use Pearson or Savas, like that is a resource. So I think what bothers me is that when people fall into that rut, right? And so don't view it as that is your curriculum. That is a resource, and I think that is what separates it. If you view it as this program is my curriculum, then you are never going to change because you're just kind of running the same things over and over and over again. Whereas you say that is a resource that I could utilize to teach this skill, then you get to be creative because, okay, well, that's just something I can use, but I could also use these other things.
We're about to be on for another
You're preaching
hour.
to the choir here, man, on
Yeah.
that.
That is my biggest gripe right
You're
now.
coming. You just booked your ticket to another show. That's a given.
Hey, we could
There
do a
we
part
go.
two.
Yeah.
I mean,
I have loved this conversation. I know I'm speaking for Ken as well. As we wrap up this episode, I'd love to continue learning and being in contact with you. Can you share the best way for us to continue this conversation and follow along with you in your educational journey?
yeah. So the best place to be honest is Twitter. At underscore CW Consulting. I used to get mad that I had to use the underscore, but it is what it is now. Somebody has the CW and they don't use it, which is infuriating.
That makes it worse.
Um, yeah, but you could all over on Twitter. That's the best place if you want to like connect and engage. As I mentioned, there's the podcast, the Counter Narrative podcast. It's across so many different platforms. You can find that new episodes every single Friday. You can catch me through Inside Principal at Inside Principal. That's the web show, and then of course you could go to the website. And again, another infuriating. So it's the CW Consulting service because CW Consulting is taken. But yeah, but the best place if you want to really connect and interact and engage is Twitter. If you follow me, I promise I'll follow you back, and you get a little message from me if you follow me. But communicate, like shoot me a message or join, ask me to join a Twitter chat or whatever. I just I love to talk, as you guys know, obviously from this conversation. I love to talk education, and you can't really do that in those other spaces, but I can do it in Twitter. So feel free, look me up. I love to connect.
Yeah, that's how you landed your spot here on the show. I followed you, you followed me back, and I got that message, and we engaged in conversation. And a couple weeks later, you're sitting here with us. Uh, Real quick, the CW Consulting, is it the same person that has both the Twitter handle and the website that you want?
That's a good point. I should look that up. Um, but yeah, it was like when I went to get the handle, it was like see, and I was like, okay, so I went and looked, and I was like, you have like no tweets. Like, why do you have my hand? Like, get rid. But now I've done that, so I've it's on Instagram,
Yep.
which you can follow. Like, I don't know what I'm doing on Instagram. My daughters make fun of me. And I even claimed it on TikTok. I don't know, maybe one day, but
There you go.
so
All
I'm
right.
just like I'm going to claim the handle everywhere too.
Yep. You embrace the underscore, right?
The
There you go.
underscore.
So everything, your website, your podcast, and your handles and everything will be linked on our website, which can be found at powereduup.com/show 46. So that'll all be linked there, as well as some highlights and notes from our conversation. Charles, I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and your school is clearly very, very lucky to have you at the helm, leading them towards change, towards doing what's best for students and doing what's best for your teachers. So education is better as a whole because of the part that you're playing in. So thank you for the great conversation. I look forward. I'm gonna tune into one of your shows tomorrow on my drive in. So I look forward to listening to that. And Matt, why don't you take us on out of here?
All right. So as we power down this episode, Charles, you've left us feeling quite powered up, ready to get into the classroom and do what we feel is right for kids. I think as you left that as your ending message. We've heard that before, but never enough. If you're doing what's right for kids, then you're doing the right thing. So keep up the good fight. Do what you can to keep yourself healthy, happy, focused, and that translates to a good classroom environment. So thanks for being here, and everyone have a great week. We'll talk to you next time.